In the shadows of ancient Israel, when kings trembled and prophets fell silent, there lived a woman whose name history forgot, but whose power even royalty could not ignore. She dwelt in darkness, practiced forbidden arts, and on one fateful night would summon the dead back from their eternal rest. This is not just another biblical story tucked away in dusty scrolls. This is the account of the Witch of Endor, a figure so mysterious that scholars have debated her true identity for thousands of years. But here's what will shock you. Everything you think you know about this woman might be completely wrong. Was she truly a witch as we understand the term today? Or was she something else entirely? Something far more complex and fascinating than the legends suggest? And why would the most powerful king in Israel risk everything to seek her counsel in his darkest hour? Tonight, we're about to uncover truths that have been buried for millennia. We'll explore archaeological discoveries that are rewriting what we thought we knew about ancient necromancy. We'll examine the desperate final days of a king who once walked with God, but found himself abandoned in his greatest hour of need. And we'll reveal how this mysterious woman became one of the most misunderstood figures in all of Scripture. If you're ready to journey into the shadows of biblical history and discover the real story behind the Witch of Endor, drop a Y in the comments. And make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about this ancient encounter between the living and the dead. The story begins not with the witch herself, but with a kingdom in chaos and a king whose mind was fracturing under the weight of divine rejection. Picture ancient Israel in its darkest hour. The Philistine army, a formidable force of seasoned warriors, had assembled like storm clouds on the horizon. Their bronze weapons glinted in the sunlight as they prepared for what many believed would be the final battle against the chosen people of God. Standing opposite them, King Saul gazed across the valley of Gilboa, his heart pounding with a terror that no amount of royal authority could mask. This was not the same man who had once stood head and shoulders above his people, anointed by the prophet Samuel to lead Israel into a golden age. No, this Saul was broken, haunted, and utterly alone. The biblical record tells us that Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Can you imagine the crushing weight of that silence? For a king who had been personally chosen by God himself, divine abandonment was more terrifying than any earthly enemy. The very heavens seemed sealed against his cries for help. Modern psychological analysis suggests that Saul was suffering from what we might today recognize as severe depression, possibly even bipolar disorder. The relentless pressures of kingship, combined with years of military campaigns and the constant threat of assassination by his own people, had taken a devastating toll on his mental health. Combat trauma, mood swings, paranoia, and violent outbursts had become his constant companions. But Saul's condition went deeper than mere psychological distress. This was spiritual crisis at its most profound level. The man who had once been filled with the Spirit of God now found himself cut off from the very source of his strength and guidance. Samuel, the prophet who had anointed him and served as his spiritual counselor, was dead and buried in Ramah. The Urim and Thummim, the sacred lots used to discern God's will, remained silent. Even his dreams, once a pathway for divine communication, brought him no comfort or clarity. In desperation, Saul turned to his servants with a request that would have been unthinkable in his earlier years. "Find me a woman who is a medium," he commanded, "that I may go to her and inquire of her." The irony was devastating. This was the same king who had previously issued royal edicts, banning all forms of necromancy and divination from the land. He had systematically purged Israel of mediums, sorcerers, and those who consulted the dead, following the clear commandments of the law of Moses. Yet now, in his darkest hour, Saul was willing to violate his own decrees and risk his eternal soul for even the faintest hope of guidance. His servants, recognizing the desperation in their king's voice, whispered among themselves before one finally spoke up. "There is a medium at Endor," they told him. Endor, The very name carried ominous implications. Located in the territory of Manasseh, this small settlement, nestled between the hill of Moreh and Mount Tabor, had a reputation that extended far beyond its modest size. Archaeological evidence suggests that Endor had been a Canaanite stronghold that the Israelites had never fully conquered. It remained a place where ancient practices survived, where the old ways persisted despite decades of Hebrew occupation. The name itself may have meant spring of generations, a designation that some scholars believe reflects the area's long association with necromantic practices. This was a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin, where practitioners of forbidden arts could ply their trade in relative safety. But who was this woman of Endor? The biblical text gives us frustratingly little information about her identity. We don't know her name, her age, her background, or how she came to practice these forbidden arts. What we do know is that she possessed a reputation significant enough that even royal servants knew of her existence and location. The Hebrew text describes her as a woman who possessed an av, a term that modern scholarship has revealed to be far more complex than early translators understood. For centuries, this word was simply rendered as familiar spirit, leading to images of witches with demonic companions. But recent archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of what an av actually was. Hebrew language experts now believe that av was likely a loanword borrowed from the Indo-European Hittites, probably transmitted through contact with the Philistines. In Hittite texts, the word refers specifically to a ritual pit used for summoning the dead from the netherworld. This wasn't about communing with demons or familiar spirits as later European witch trials would suggest. This was necromancy in its most literal sense, the practice of calling forth the spirits of the deceased. Archaeological excavations throughout Israel and the broader ancient Near East have uncovered multiple examples of these ritual pits, confirming that necromancy was far more widespread and accepted in the ancient world than many modern religious traditions acknowledge. These weren't crude holes in the ground, but carefully constructed chambers designed specifically for communication with the dead. The woman of Endor, then, was not necessarily the cackling hag of later folklore. She was likely a skilled practitioner of ancient religious techniques, someone who understood the complex rituals required to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. In a world where the supernatural was accepted as part of daily reality, such individuals served important social functions, providing comfort to the grieving and guidance to the desperate. But practicing such arts in Israel under Saul's reign was extraordinarily dangerous. The king's earlier purges had made it clear that anyone caught engaging in necromancy faced severe punishment, possibly even death. The fact that this woman continued to operate suggests either remarkable courage or desperate economic necessity. Perhaps both. As Saul prepared for his clandestine journey to Endor, he faced a journey fraught with both physical and spiritual peril. The route from his camp to the medium's dwelling would take him directly through enemy territory. Philistine patrols roamed the countryside, and discovery would mean certain death or capture. But Saul was beyond caring about such mundane dangers. The terror in his heart far exceeded any fear of earthly enemies. Under cover of darkness, the king disguised himself in common clothing, stripping away all the royal regalia that marked his station. Accompanied by only 2 trusted servants, he began the treacherous journey across the valley. Every shadow could conceal a Philistine scout. Every sound might herald discovery and doom. The psychological state of mind that drove Saul to such desperate measures reveals the complete breakdown of his relationship with the divine. This was a man who had once been filled with prophetic power, who had led Israel's armies to victory through divine guidance. Now he was reduced to skulking through the night like a common criminal, seeking forbidden counsel from a practitioner of arts he had previously condemned. As the small party approached Endor, Saul must have wrestled with the magnitude of what he was about to do. Every step took him further from the light of divine approval and deeper into the shadows of spiritual rebellion. Yet he pressed on, driven by a desperation that overwhelmed his remaining moral compass. The woman they sought lived in a world of shadows and whispers, her very existence a defiance of royal decree and religious law. She had survived Saul's purges through cunning, secrecy, and perhaps a network of clients who valued her services more than they feared royal punishment. Her dwelling likely reflected the precarious nature of her position, modest and easily abandoned if discovery threatened. When the disguised king and his companions finally reached her door in the dead of night, they were about to participate in one of the most extraordinary encounters recorded in biblical history. The meeting between Israel's anointed king and the forbidden medium of Endor would unleash forces that none of them fully understood, setting in motion events that would reshape the destiny of a nation. The woman who answered their desperate knock had no idea that she was about to become one of the most debated figures in all of Scripture. She possessed knowledge and abilities that both terrified and fascinated those who encountered her. She was keeper of secrets that bridged the gap between life and death, between the seen and unseen worlds. But was she truly the malevolent witch that later centuries would make her out to be? Or was she something far more complex? A practitioner of ancient arts that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The answers to these questions lie buried in the shadows of that fateful night, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to look beyond the surface of this extraordinary biblical account. What happened next would test the boundaries between faith and desperation, between the natural and supernatural worlds, between life and death itself. The stage was set for an encounter that would echo through the ages, leaving scholars and believers to wrestle with questions that remain as challenging today as they were 3,000 years ago. The confrontation that followed reveals layers of deception, fear, and desperate cunning that illuminate the complex social dynamics of ancient Israel. When the woman of Endor opened her door to these three strangers cloaked in darkness, her first instinct was suspicion. Years of operating in the shadows had honed her ability to detect danger, and something about these visitors set her nerves on edge. Saul, still maintaining his disguise, made his request with the careful language of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Divine for me by a spirit," he commanded, "and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." But the woman was no fool. She had survived this long by being cautious, and this request reeked of entrapment. Her response was sharp and immediate. "Behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" This wasn't just paranoia speaking. This was the voice of someone who had watched friends and colleagues disappear in the night, victims of royal persecution. The woman's reaction tells us something crucial about the social climate of Saul's Israel. Practitioners of necromancy hadn't simply vanished from the land. They had gone underground, operating in secret networks of mutual protection and shared danger. They knew each other's fates, whispered warnings through hidden channels, and lived in constant fear of discovery. But Saul was prepared for her resistance. With the authority of someone accustomed to command, he swore a solemn oath. "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." The irony of invoking God's name to guarantee protection for an act that violated God's law was apparently lost on the desperate king. Or perhaps it revealed just how far his moral compass had been shattered by his circumstances. The woman studied these strangers more carefully. Something about the leader's bearing, his way of speaking, the deference shown by his companions, began to stir recognition. But she had little choice. The oath had been sworn, the request made clear. "Whom shall I bring up for you?" she asked. "Bring up Samuel for me," came Saul's reply. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Samuel, the great prophet, judge, and kingmaker of Israel. The man whose very mention could silence crowds and whose authority had shaped a generation. Samuel, who even in death remained the most revered figure in the nation's recent history. What happened next has puzzled scholars and theologians for millennia. The woman began her ritual, employing techniques passed down through generations of practitioners. But something went wrong. Or perhaps something went inexplicably right. The biblical text describes her reaction with stark simplicity. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. This wasn't the controlled manifestation of a practiced medium. This was shock, terror, and complete surprise. Whatever she had expected to conjure from her ritual pit, it wasn't this. Her scream pierced the night air, and suddenly all pretense was abandoned. "Why have you deceived me?" she demanded, turning on Saul with newfound recognition. "You are Saul." The disguise that had fooled her in darkness was useless now. Perhaps it was his bearing when confronted with the supernatural, or simply the way he reacted to her terror, but his true identity became unmistakable. The king's response reveals both his desperation and his complete abandonment of royal protocol. "Do not be afraid," he told her. A king reassuring a woman whose very existence his own laws had made illegal. "What do you see?" For Saul himself could see nothing. The apparition that had so terrified the medium remained invisible to him. Her description of what she witnessed has fascinated scholars of ancient religion and anthropology. "I see a god coming up out of the earth," she reported, using the Hebrew word Elohim that could refer to divine beings, spirits, or supernatural entities. When pressed for more details, she described an old man covered with a robe. This detail about Saul's inability to see the apparition while the medium could observe it clearly aligns with ancient Jewish traditions about necromantic practices. According to these traditions, the practitioner could see summoned spirits, but could not hear their voices, while the person for whom the spirit was called could hear but not see. This division of supernatural perception adds another layer of mystery to an already enigmatic encounter. The theological implications of what occurred next have sparked debates that continue to this day. Was this truly Samuel returning from the grave, or was it an elaborate demonic deception? The text itself offers conflicting evidence that has kept scholars arguing for centuries. Those who believe Samuel actually appeared point to several compelling factors. First, the medium's genuine surprise suggests this wasn't her usual routine. Second, the message delivered proved to be devastatingly accurate in its prophecy. Third, the text consistently refers to the apparition as Samuel, not as something pretending to be Samuel. But skeptics argue that demons could easily have mimicked Samuel's appearance and voice, especially to deliver a prophecy that anyone with military knowledge could have predicted. They point to other biblical passages that suggest the dead cannot return to communicate with the living, making any such appearance necessarily false. The apparition, whether truly Samuel or not, wasted no time on pleasantries. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" it demanded. The tone was one of irritation and impatience, hardly the comforting counsel Saul had hoped to receive. Saul's response revealed the full depth of his desperation. "I am in great distress," he confessed, "for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." Here was the most powerful man in Israel, reduced to pleading with what he hoped was the ghost of a dead prophet. The confession laid bare not just his military predicament, but his complete spiritual isolation. God had turned away from him. The prophets were silent. His dreams brought no guidance. He was utterly, completely alone. The response he received was not what he had come to hear. "But why do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy?" The apparition's words cut to the heart of Saul's condition. There was no comfort to be found here, no secret strategy that would turn the tide of battle. The spiritual reality underlying his military crisis was stark and unforgiving. What followed was a prophecy of such precise accuracy that it has convinced many believers that Samuel truly did return from the dead to deliver God's final judgment on the fallen king. "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me," the Spirit declared. "For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David." The prophecy didn't stop with political consequences. "Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day." Here was the root of Saul's downfall, traced back to a specific act of disobedience, a moment when mercy had seemed more appealing than divine justice. But the most chilling words were yet to come. "Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." The prophecy was specific, immediate, and absolute. Not just defeat, but death. Not just for Saul, but for his sons as well. The impact of these words on Saul was devastating and immediate. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. He had no strength left, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The king who had come seeking hope found only the confirmation of his worst fears. The woman of Endor, witnessing the complete collapse of this powerful man, revealed a side of her character that complicates our understanding of her role. Despite the danger his presence brought to her, despite the years of persecution she had endured under his reign, she showed him genuine compassion in his moment of utter defeat. "Behold, your servant has obeyed your voice," she said, "and I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you, and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." This moment of human kindness in the midst of supernatural terror reveals the complex humanity of the woman we know only as the Witch of Endor. She wasn't the cackling villain of later folklore, but a person capable of compassion, even toward those who had made her life dangerous and difficult. Saul initially refused her offer, but his servants joined the woman in urging him to eat. Together, they prevailed upon the broken king to accept this final act of hospitality. The woman quickly prepared a meal, slaughtering a fattened calf and baking unleavened bread with her own hands. The image is both touching and tragic. A king sharing what would likely be his last meal with a woman whose very existence his laws had criminalized. Former enemies brought together by the shared recognition of human frailty in the face of supernatural judgment. As dawn approached, Saul and his companions departed, carrying with them the weight of prophecy that would prove devastatingly accurate. The next day, exactly as foretold, the battle at Mount Gilboa would claim the lives of Saul and 3 of his sons, including the beloved Jonathan. But what of the woman they left behind? Her story doesn't end with Saul's departure into the pre-dawn darkness. She had witnessed something that night that would haunt her for the rest of her days, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about her craft and her place in the cosmic order. The woman of Endor had practiced her forbidden arts for years, perhaps decades, serving a clientele desperate enough to risk royal punishment for a glimpse beyond the veil of death. She had summoned spirits before, conducted rituals in her carefully constructed pit, whispered incantations passed down through generations of practitioners. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what occurred that night. In the aftermath of Saul's departure, she found herself grappling with questions that shattered her understanding of the supernatural world she thought she knew so well. Had she actually summoned the great prophet Samuel from his rest, or had something far more powerful intervened in her ritual? The genuine terror she had experienced suggested this was no ordinary manifestation of her craft. Consider the implications of what she witnessed. This woman, skilled in the ancient arts of necromancy, had been performing these rituals for years without incident. She knew what to expect when she called upon the spirits of the dead. The familiar sensations, the predictable manifestations, the controlled environment of her sacred pit. But Samuel's appearance had caught her completely off guard. The Hebrew term used to describe her reaction tells us everything we need to know about the authenticity of her shock. She didn't simply see a spirit, she cried out with a loud voice, a phrase indicating genuine terror and surprise. This wasn't the controlled response of a medium manipulating her client with theatrical effects. This was raw, unfiltered fear from someone who realized she was witnessing something beyond her comprehension or control. Archaeological discoveries in recent years have provided fascinating insights into exactly how such necromantic rituals were conducted in the ancient world. Excavations throughout Israel and the broader Near Eastern region have uncovered multiple examples of ritual pits designed specifically for communicating with the dead. These weren't crude holes in the ground, but carefully engineered structures that reflected sophisticated understanding of the supernatural arts. The most significant discovery came from the Teomim Cave in the Jerusalem Hills, where Israeli archaeologists uncovered evidence of extensive necromantic activity dating back to the biblical period. The cave contained ritual items, inscribed skulls, and the remains of elaborate ceremonies designed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. These findings confirm that necromancy was far more widespread and accepted in the ancient world than many modern religious traditions acknowledge. But here's what makes the Endor encounter so remarkable. The archaeological evidence suggests that practitioners of necromancy typically worked with familiar spirits, demonic entities that masqueraded as the deceased to provide information or comfort to the living. These were controlled interactions, predictable exchanges between the medium and supernatural beings she had worked with before. What happened with Samuel appears to have been something entirely different. The medium's shock suggests she was expecting to encounter her usual spiritual contacts, but instead found herself face to face with something far more powerful and authentic. Whether this was truly Samuel returning from the grave or God himself intervening to deliver final judgment through supernatural means, it clearly wasn't business as usual for the woman of Endor. The theological debate surrounding this encounter has raged for centuries, with scholars and religious authorities taking passionate positions on both sides. Those who argue that Samuel actually appeared point to the accuracy of the prophecy delivered, the medium's genuine surprise, and the biblical text's consistent reference to the apparition as Samuel himself, not as something pretending to be Samuel. Orthodox Jewish interpretation largely rejects the possibility that the dead can return to communicate with the living. The Babylonian Talmud suggests that what appeared was either a demonic deception or, in some interpretations, that God temporarily suspended the natural order to allow Samuel to deliver this final message of judgment. This view maintains that the medium's usual practices involved familiar spirits, demons that impersonated the dead, but that this particular instance was divinely orchestrated for a specific purpose. Christian theological traditions have been similarly divided. Early church fathers like John Chrysostom argued that the apparition was demonic, while others like Augustine suggested it might have been divinely permitted for the purpose of delivering God's judgment on Saul. The debate continues today, with different denominations and theological schools taking various positions on the nature of what occurred. But perhaps we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of focusing solely on whether Samuel actually appeared, we should consider what this encounter reveals about the desperation that drives people to seek supernatural solutions to spiritual problems. Saul's journey to Endor represents more than just a consultation with a medium. It represents the complete breakdown of his relationship with God and his willingness to violate everything he once held sacred in pursuit of guidance. The woman of Endor, for her part, found herself caught in the middle of a cosmic drama far beyond her understanding. She was a practitioner of forbidden arts who had managed to survive in a hostile environment through caution and skill. But on this night, her carefully controlled world of ritual and routine was shattered by forces that transcended her experience. Modern psychological analysis of the encounter provides additional layers of understanding. Saul's mental state at the time of his visit to Endor suggests someone suffering from severe depression, possibly complicated by what we might today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder from years of warfare and political pressure. His desperate journey across enemy lines to consult a practitioner of forbidden arts reveals the depths of his psychological and spiritual crisis. The woman herself emerges from the narrative as a complex figure who defies simple categorization. She wasn't the cackling witch of medieval imagination, nor was she a simple charlatan preying on the desperate. She appears to have been a skilled practitioner of ancient religious techniques who genuinely believed in her abilities and served a real social function in her community. Her initial caution when approached by the disguised Saul reveals someone who understood the dangers of her profession and had developed survival strategies to navigate them. Her later compassion toward the broken king shows a depth of character that complicates our understanding of her role in the narrative. She fed a man who had made her life dangerous, showing kindness to someone who had persecuted people like her for years. The historical context of necromantic practices in the ancient Near East helps us understand both the woman's role and Saul's desperation. These weren't fringe practices conducted by social outcasts, but established religious techniques that had been part of the cultural landscape for centuries. The Israelite prohibition against such practices was relatively recent and represented a sharp break from the religious traditions of their neighbors. The woman of Endor was practicing arts that would have been considered legitimate religious activity in virtually every other culture of her time. The Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Greeks all had established traditions of communicating with the dead through various ritual means. What made her activities forbidden wasn't their inherent evil, but their violation of the specific covenant relationship between Israel and their God. This understanding doesn't excuse the practice from a biblical perspective, but it helps explain why such practitioners continued to operate despite official prohibition. They were meeting a genuine human need for guidance and comfort in times of crisis, a need that the official religious establishment wasn't always equipped to address. The lasting impact of the Endor encounter extends far beyond the immediate narrative. The story has continued to fascinate and disturb readers for thousands of years, raising questions about the nature of death, the possibility of communication with the deceased, and the limits of supernatural intervention in human affairs. Medieval and Renaissance artists were particularly drawn to the dramatic possibilities of the scene, creating countless paintings and illustrations of the mysterious woman summoning Samuel's spirit before the terrified king. These artistic interpretations often reflected the theological and cultural attitudes of their time, sometimes portraying the woman as a malevolent witch, other times as a tragic figure caught in forces beyond her control. The transformation of the woman of Endor into the archetypal witch of European folklore represents one of the most significant misinterpretations of the biblical text. During the witch trial period of the 16th and 17th centuries, her story was cited as biblical evidence for the existence of malevolent witches and divine validation for the persecution of suspected practitioners of witchcraft. This transformation from a complex biblical figure into a symbol of evil witchcraft reveals more about the fears and prejudices of later cultures than it does about the original narrative. The woman of Endor became a convenient scapegoat for societies, grappling with their own anxieties about supernatural forces and feminine power. But the original story presents a far more nuanced picture. The woman we encounter in the biblical text is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather a complex human being navigating dangerous circumstances with a mixture of caution, skill, and unexpected compassion. Her encounter with Saul reveals layers of character that resist simple moral categorization. As we continue to unravel the mystery of who the woman of Endor really was, we must resist the temptation to impose our own cultural assumptions on her story. She existed in a world where the supernatural was accepted as part of daily reality, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were understood differently than they are today. Her story challenges us to grapple with profound questions about the nature of spiritual authority, the limits of human knowledge, and the consequences of abandoning our deepest convictions in times of crisis. Whether we view her as a practitioner of forbidden arts, or as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond her control, her encounter with the desperate king of Israel continues to resonate with readers seeking to understand the complex relationship between faith, desperation, and the search for meaning in the face of overwhelming darkness. The deeper we delve into the archaeological record, the more we discover that the woman of Endor operated within a sophisticated network of ancient, religious practices that stretched across the entire ancient world. Recent excavations have uncovered ritual chambers and necromantic sites throughout the region, revealing that what she practiced wasn't some crude folk magic, but part of an elaborate religious system with its own theology, methodology, and social structure. Consider the complexity of what she had mastered. This wasn't simply lighting candles and chanting mysterious words. The Hebrew term av that describes her practice has been traced back to Hittite origins, suggesting that these techniques had been refined and transmitted across cultures for generations. She was the keeper of knowledge that bridged civilizations, a practitioner of arts that required years of training and deep understanding of spiritual principles that most people couldn't even comprehend. The ritual pit she used, what archaeologists now call a ghost pit, wasn't just a hole in the ground. These were carefully engineered structures, often lined with stone and designed according to specific architectural principles that reflected ancient understanding of how the spiritual and physical worlds intersected. The construction alone would have required significant resources and knowledge, suggesting that practitioners like her held positions of considerable importance in their communities. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. The woman's reaction to Samuel's appearance suggests that her usual practice involved something entirely different from what occurred that night. She had likely spent years working with what the ancient world called familiar spirits, supernatural entities that served as intermediaries between the living and the dead. These weren't necessarily evil beings in the ancient understanding, but rather spiritual servants who could be called upon to provide information or assistance. The shock she experienced when Samuel appeared indicates that this was something far beyond her normal experience. Instead of the familiar spiritual contacts she was accustomed to working with, she found herself confronting a force of such power and authenticity that it terrified her. This wasn't just another routine consultation with the spirit world. This was an encounter with something that transcended all her previous understanding of how the supernatural realm operated. What makes this encounter even more remarkable is the way it challenges our modern assumptions about ancient religious practices. We tend to view necromancy through the lens of medieval European witchcraft, imagining crude rituals performed by ignorant peasants seeking to commune with demons. But the archaeological evidence paints a very different picture of practitioners like the woman of Endor. These were skilled religious professionals who served important social functions in their communities. They provided comfort to the grieving, guidance to the confused, and hope to the desperate. Their practices were based on sophisticated theological understanding that had been developed and refined over centuries. They weren't outcasts operating on the fringes of society, but respected specialists who possessed knowledge that others desperately needed. The woman of Endor's survival during Saul's persecution campaigns tells us something crucial about her position in the community. Despite the royal edicts against practitioners of her arts, she had managed to continue operating, suggesting that she had powerful protectors, or that her services were considered too valuable to eliminate completely. This wasn't someone hiding in caves and practicing forbidden rituals in secret. This was a professional who had found ways to maintain her practice despite official opposition. Her initial wariness when Saul and his companions arrived reveals someone who had developed sophisticated survival strategies. She immediately suspected entrapment, suggesting that she understood the political dimensions of her work and had learned to navigate them carefully. This wasn't paranoia, but practical wisdom gained through experience in a dangerous profession. The way she handled Saul's request demonstrates remarkable psychological insight. She didn't immediately comply with his demands, but tested his commitment and sincerity. Only when he swore a binding oath did she agree to perform the ritual, showing that she understood the spiritual as well as legal implications of what she was being asked to do. When the supernatural encounter began to unfold, her professional composure completely collapsed. The scream that pierced the night air wasn't theatrical performance designed to impress her client. This was genuine terror from someone who realized that the carefully controlled environment of her practice had been shattered by forces beyond her comprehension or control. Her immediate recognition of Saul's true identity in that moment of supernatural chaos reveals something profound about the connection between spiritual insight and earthly perception. Perhaps the same abilities that allowed her to commune with the spirit world also gave her unusual sensitivity to the hidden nature of the people around her. The disguise that had fooled her in the darkness became transparent when confronted with genuine supernatural manifestation. The conversation that followed between Saul and the apparition provides crucial insights into both the king's desperate state of mind and the nature of what the woman had somehow called forth. Whether this was truly Samuel returning from the grave or some other supernatural intervention, the accuracy of the prophecy delivered suggests that genuine divine communication was occurring, not mere theatrical manipulation. The prophecy itself was devastating in its precision and scope. Not only did it correctly predict Saul's defeat and death, but it traced his downfall back to specific acts of disobedience that had occurred years earlier. This wasn't general fortune-telling based on obvious military circumstances, but detailed knowledge of spiritual cause and effect that only divine insight could provide. The impact of these words on Saul was immediate and overwhelming. The biblical text describes him falling full length on the ground, filled with fear and drained of all strength. This wasn't just the reaction of a man receiving bad news. This was the complete psychological and spiritual collapse of someone who had finally confronted the ultimate consequences of his choices. In that moment of utter devastation, the woman of Endor revealed aspects of her character that complicate our understanding of her role in the narrative. Despite the years of persecution she had endured under Saul's reign, despite the danger his presence brought to her dwelling, she showed him genuine compassion in his hour of greatest need. Her offer to prepare food for the broken king wasn't motivated by hope of reward or fear of punishment. Saul was clearly a defeated man with no power left to threaten or protect anyone. Her kindness came from simple human empathy for someone who was suffering, regardless of their past relationship or future prospects. The meal she prepared took on almost sacramental significance in the context of what had just occurred. Here was a woman whose very existence had been criminalized by royal decree, preparing what would likely be the last meal for the king who had made her life dangerous. The act transformed both of them from their official roles into simply two human beings sharing a moment of connection in the face of overwhelming darkness. The image of Saul sitting at the table of the woman he had persecuted, accepting nourishment from hands that practiced arts he had forbidden, represents one of the most poignant ironies in biblical literature. The hunter had become the hunted, the powerful had become powerless, and the forbidden had become the only source of comfort available. As dawn approached and Saul prepared to depart for what both he and the woman knew would be his final battle, the full tragedy of his situation became clear. He had sought supernatural guidance because divine communication had been cut off, but the message he received confirmed that the silence itself was God's answer to his rebellion. The woman watched him leave, carrying with her the knowledge that she had witnessed something extraordinary and terrible. She had seen a king reduced to begging for hope from the very people he had oppressed. She had participated in a supernatural encounter that transcended anything in her previous experience. And she had shown kindness to someone who had never shown kindness to her. Her story doesn't end with Saul's departure into the pre-dawn darkness. She continued to live with the memory of that night, grappling with questions about the nature of her craft and her place in the cosmic order. Had she actually summoned Samuel from his eternal rest? Or had divine forces intervened in her ritual for purposes she couldn't understand? The transformation of her reputation over the centuries reflects changing cultural attitudes towards supernatural practices and feminine power. What began as a complex biblical narrative about desperation, divine judgment, and unexpected compassion gradually became a symbol of malevolent witchcraft in the popular imagination. During the European witch trial period, Her story was cited as biblical proof that witches existed and posed real supernatural threats to Christian society. This interpretation ignored the nuances of the original narrative, reducing a complex figure to a convenient symbol of evil that justified persecution of suspected practitioners of witchcraft. The real woman of Endor was neither the malevolent witch of medieval folklore nor the simple charlatan of skeptical interpretation. She was a skilled practitioner of ancient religious arts who found herself at the center of a cosmic drama far beyond her understanding or control. Her encounter with Saul reveals layers of character that resist simple moral categorization. She was cautious enough to survive in a hostile environment, skilled enough to maintain a professional practice despite official persecution, and compassionate enough to show kindness to someone who had made her life dangerous. These qualities don't align with our stereotypical images of either evil witches or fraudulent mediums. The archaeological evidence continues to expand our understanding of practitioners like her, revealing a world where the supernatural was accepted as part of daily reality and where specialists in spiritual arts served important social functions. These weren't fringe figures operating on the margins of society, but respected professionals who possessed knowledge that others desperately needed. Modern psychological analysis of the encounter provides additional insights into both Saul's desperation and the woman's response to his crisis. His willingness to risk everything for even the possibility of divine guidance reveals the depths of his spiritual isolation. Her compassionate response to his suffering demonstrates emotional intelligence that transcends cultural and religious boundaries. The lasting fascination with their story reflects enduring human concerns about death, divine communication, and the search for meaning in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Whether we interpret the encounter as genuine supernatural intervention or elaborate psychological drama, it continues to resonate with readers seeking to understand the complex relationship between faith, desperation, and the human condition. The Woman of Endor challenges us to look beyond surface assumptions about ancient religious practices and consider the complex human motivations that drove people to seek supernatural solutions to their problems. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human experience, compassion and dignity can emerge in unexpected ways. As we piece together the fragments of her story from biblical text, archaeological evidence, and historical context, we discover a figure far more complex and fascinating than the simple witch of popular imagination. She was a woman of her time who possessed skills and knowledge that made her both valuable and dangerous in equal measure. Her encounter with Saul represents more than just a supernatural consultation. It reveals the tragic consequences of spiritual rebellion, the desperate measures people will take when cut off from divine guidance, and the unexpected ways that human compassion can manifest even in the darkest circumstances. The mystery of who she really was may never be fully solved, but her story continues to challenge and inspire readers who recognize in her narrative the eternal human struggle to find meaning, hope, and connection in a world that often seems abandoned by the divine. She remains one of Scripture's most enigmatic figures, a woman whose name history forgot, but whose story refuses to be forgotten. The truth is, the Woman of Endor represents something far more profound than the simple categories of good and evil that we often try to impose on biblical figures. She stands at the intersection of desperate human need and divine mystery, a testament to the complex ways that God works, even through the most unlikely circumstances. Think about this for a moment. Here was a woman who practiced arts that were explicitly forbidden by God's law. Yet she became the vessel through which the most accurate prophecy in Israel's recent history was delivered. She was operating outside the boundaries of acceptable religious practice, yet God apparently chose to use her ritual to communicate his final judgment on a rebellious king. This paradox challenges our neat theological categories and forces us to grapple with the mysterious ways that divine sovereignty operates in human affairs. It reminds us that God's purposes can be accomplished even through broken vessels, even through practices that fall outside the bounds of orthodox faith. The woman's final act of compassion towards Saul reveals perhaps the most important aspect of her character. After witnessing the complete devastation of this powerful man, after seeing him reduced to a trembling shadow of his former self, she chose mercy over vengeance. She could have turned him away, could have reminded him of the years of persecution she had endured under his reign. Instead, she opened her home and her heart to someone in desperate need. This act of kindness in the face of past injustice reflects something beautiful about the human capacity for forgiveness and grace. It shows us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when we've been hurt by those in power, we can choose to respond with compassion rather than bitterness. Her story also serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of spiritual rebellion and the consequences of abandoning our relationship with God. Saul's journey to Endor wasn't just a desperate attempt to gain military intelligence. It was the final step in a long process of spiritual decline that began with small compromises and escalated into complete apostasy. The king who had once walked with God, who had been filled with the Spirit and used mightily in Israel's service, ended his life consulting practitioners of forbidden arts because he had systematically destroyed his relationship with the divine. His story reminds us that no one is immune to spiritual downfall, that even the most blessed and favored can lose their way if they consistently choose disobedience over faithfulness. Yet even in judgment, God's character shines through. The prophecy delivered that night wasn't just condemnation, it was clarity. Saul had been tormented by uncertainty, by the silence of heaven, by the terror of not knowing what lay ahead. The message he received, though devastating, at least gave him the truth he desperately needed to hear. Sometimes God's mercy manifests not in giving us what we want, but in giving us what we need to understand our situation. The divine silence that had tormented Saul was finally broken, not with the comfort he sought, but with the reality he needed to face. The woman of Endor witnessed all of this unfold in her humble dwelling. She saw the mighty brought low, the proud humbled, the desperate given truth instead of false hope. She participated in a moment of divine revelation that would be remembered for thousands of years, yet she remains largely anonymous in the historical record. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition. She was simply trying to survive in a dangerous world, using the skills she possessed to meet the needs of people who came to her in desperation. Her encounter with Saul transformed her from a peripheral figure into a central player in one of Scripture's most dramatic scenes. The archaeological evidence continues to shed new light on practitioners like her, revealing a world far more complex and sophisticated than we might have imagined. These weren't ignorant peasants dabbling in crude superstitions, but skilled professionals who understood complex spiritual principles and served important social functions in their communities. Their practices were rooted in theological systems that had been developed and refined over centuries. They possessed knowledge about the intersection of the natural and supernatural worlds that most people couldn't comprehend. They served as bridges between the seen and unseen realms, helping their clients navigate spiritual realities that were accepted as fundamental aspects of existence. The woman of Endor operated within this broader context of ancient religious practice. She wasn't an isolated figure practicing strange rituals in complete secrecy, but part of a larger network of spiritual specialists who provided services that their communities valued highly enough to seek out despite official prohibition. Her survival during Saul's persecution campaigns tells us that she had developed sophisticated strategies for operating in a hostile environment. She had learned to be cautious without being paralyzed by fear, professional without being reckless, and adaptable without compromising the integrity of her practice. The night Saul came to her door changed everything. What began as another consultation, another desperate client seeking supernatural guidance, became an encounter with forces that transcended her understanding and experience. She found herself at the center of a cosmic drama involving the fate of nations and the judgment of kings. Her reaction to Samuel's appearance reveals someone who understood the significance of what was occurring. This wasn't just another routine summoning. This was something unprecedented, something that shattered her assumptions about how the spiritual world operated and her role in facilitating communication between the living and the dead. The compassion she showed to Saul in the aftermath of this supernatural encounter demonstrates character traits that complicate our understanding of her moral status. She wasn't the malevolent figure of later folklore, nor was she simply a cynical fraud preying on desperate people. She was a complex human being capable of both practicing forbidden arts and showing genuine kindness to those in need. Her story challenges us to look beyond surface judgments and consider the deeper, human motivations that drive people's choices. She lived in a world where supernatural forces were accepted as real and where specialists in spiritual arts served legitimate social functions. Her practices may have been forbidden by Israelite law, but they weren't necessarily motivated by evil intent. The transformation of her image over the centuries reflects changing cultural attitudes towards supernatural practices and feminine power. What began as a nuanced biblical narrative about desperation, divine intervention, and human compassion gradually became a symbol of malevolent witchcraft that justified persecution of suspected practitioners of forbidden arts. This transformation tells us more about the fears and prejudices of later cultures than it does about the original figure. The real woman of Endor was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather a complex individual navigating dangerous circumstances with a mixture of skill, caution, and unexpected grace. As we reach the end of our journey into the shadows of biblical history, we're left with more questions than answers about this mysterious figure. We may never know her name, her background, or the full details of her life and practice. But her encounter with Saul has preserved her story for thousands of years, ensuring that her brief moment at the center of divine drama continues to challenge and inspire new generations of readers. The woman of Endor reminds us that God's purposes can be accomplished through the most unlikely vessels, that divine mercy can manifest in unexpected ways, and that human compassion can emerge even in the darkest circumstances. Her story is ultimately about the complex intersection of human desperation and divine sovereignty, about the mysterious ways that truth can emerge from the most unlikely sources. Whether we view her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of forbidden practices, or as an example of unexpected grace in impossible circumstances, her encounter with the desperate king of Israel continues to resonate with anyone who has ever felt abandoned by heaven or driven to seek answers in forbidden places. The shadows of Endor may have claimed many secrets, but they could not hide the fundamental truth that emerges from this ancient encounter. Even in our darkest moments, even when we've lost our way completely, the possibility of truth, grace, and redemption remains. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected sources, delivered by the most unlikely messengers, in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about how God works in the world. The woman of Endor stands as a testament to these eternal truths, a mysterious figure whose story refuses to be forgotten because it speaks to something deep within the human experience. She reminds us that we are all more complex than our labels suggest, that divine purposes can be accomplished through broken vessels, and that compassion has the power to transcend even the deepest divisions. Her legacy lives on not in monuments or memorials, but in the questions her story continues to raise and the truths it continues to reveal about the mysterious intersection of human need and divine grace. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to a woman whose name history forgot, but whose story refuses to be forgotten. If this journey into biblical mystery has opened your eyes to truths you've never considered before, I encourage you to share this video with others who might benefit from these insights. Drop a comment below sharing which aspect of the woman of Endor's story impacted you most deeply. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the hidden depths of Scripture. The mysteries of the Bible are far from exhausted, and there are countless other figures whose stories deserve to be told, whose truths deserve to be uncovered, and whose lessons deserve to be learned. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of ancient Israel. Until next time, may you find light in the darkest corners of sacred history and wisdom in the most unexpected places.